Um, Hi, everybody, and welcome back to week 5, A Modern Indian, ? We are obviously joined by Dr. Paul Gareau, Dr. Tracy Bear, and today, I said Gareau today for the first time when it's Gareau. I don't know why I did that.
I like
got
them both,
nervous
actually.
in the introductions. I always get nervous in the introductions for no apparent reason. And just too much pressure. It's like,
That's a weird word.
and today we have Dr. Nykkie Lugosi with us to help the conversation, to offer her incredible insight. So I'm going to call you Dr. Nykkie.
Just Nikkie's fine.
Okay. Do you want to just introduce yourself and explain why we have you here today, and what you'll be helping us with today?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm an assistant professor in the Faculty of Native Studies with Paul and Tracy. I'm originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, but I spent a good amount of time in Toronto and now in Edmonton, so I'm a true Canadian. My background, I have Eastern European background, but then I'm also Métis and Cree. I also speak Plains Cree and teach it at the university, and then other areas of research interest are especially racism and nationhood. And that's why I've been asked here today to really help contribute to the conversation about why that colonial history is relevant today.
Excellent. Well, we're happy to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome. So shall we get on with our smudging for today?
Mm-hmm.
I had so many people ask me if they wanted to trade some, it's Paul too. Do you want to trade some sage, do some sage trading? You know, mine's from Batoche. And where was yours from, Paul?
From Frog Lake.
Yeah.
Gift from Colette Poitras. She gifted it to me.
Awesome. So this
She's
is,
listening.
late August is prime sage picking time. And I got so much from last year that I have bags of it still, so I don't need to pick any more this year. So I've been giving it a lot of it away.
Mm.
And for all you out there, let's have a little smudge for you. And of course, we smudge as somewhat of a spiritual cleansing for Indigenous people, many people actually. This medicine today is sage, as I've said before, and it's a woman's medicine from my teaching. And so it's always really good to start with this smell and this sort of little ceremony in order for us to go forward with like good discussions and making good kinship relationships and going forward in a good way. So here's to us today and our discussion, and we'll see what comes up. Hi, hi.
Hi, hi.
Hi.
It's really burning, eh? It's smudging like crazy.
Yeah, getting drier and drier, you know. Edmonton's not a very moist province. Oh my gosh.
Right on.
I feel really cheeky today. I don't know why. What's going on?
That's an exciting feeling coming into this discussion.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, so Dan, we're on week 5, and
can you believe it's week 5?
No, I can't. I feel like we've been doing this for a long time, but then again, I feel like it's just been yesterday, right?
Yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
So how are things going, and what kind of thoughts and what things are bubbling up for you this week?
You know, I think it's sort of a continuation on this ongoing, concept of how the government has actively worked to distance and separate the communities from themselves. And this assimilation to sort of settler culture and a complete disregard for sort of custom and heritage and the importance and the value of it. And it's just, I think week after week, we're learning more and more of just how active the government, active a role the government played in all of this. And I think, you know, not having this education previously, there is this, it almost feels like this idea that history kind of evolves and that things evolve over time in history. And you don't, I think obviously for many reasons, in the education of Canadian history, you don't often hear and read and learn about how active a role the government has played over time in the dismantling of cultures. And that continues to be an eye-opener for me, just how far-reaching it is and how horrible the intention behind it really is. You know, I think you never really want to feel like, you know, the history of the government of your country is rooted in something that could be so horrible. And particularly Canada, again, talking about this blanket idea of Canada being the safe haven and learning the realities of that, learning that, you know, for many Canadians, we look at our country as being a kind of, you know, it's diverse, it stands for, you know, good things, it has a lot of positive virtues, and yet I think in constantly leaning on those positive virtues, we are choosing to turn a blind eye to the reality of the history of our country. So it continues to reinforce this re-examination of the role that the government has played in our history and how detrimental that role has been to communities that were here long before any of us. So that continues to be kind of the big takeaway for me as we keep learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And we get a lot of questions like about the titles of our modules, and this one was no exception. And so we didn't just say a modern Indian, we said a modern Indian. And to help us figure out why we put that question mark on the end, we have Nykkie to sort of frame that a little bit for us. So why do you think we put that question mark there?
I think it's really provocative, and it's a clever play on how Indigenous peoples are often imagined. I say imagined because a lot of time, you know, for mainstream Canada and the U.S., quite frankly, Indians are spoken of. The term Indian is used. It's a government term that, you know, that tends to stay on, but it tends to imagine this Indian as somewhere backwards in time, that Indigenous peoples aren't in cities, they don't have jobs like, you know, doctors or lawyers, they're not participating in mainstream society, they don't want to, rather they're somewhere back in time about 200 years. And there's, you know, there's some really clever authors that talk about this. For instance, Tom King in his book, an Inconvenient Indian. Also, Drew Hayden Taylor, for those of you who like more comedy, he wrote this this book called "Funny You Don't Look Like One" and Confessions of a Blue-Eyed Ojibwe. Because a lot of times, you know, for the Canadian mainstream, they think about an Indian as backward in time, right? With buckskin and beads, there's flute music playing, you know, out by the river, hunting and gathering, right? They have to have dark hair. I mean, even with my own experiences, I've had people say, you know, are you Icelandic? Are you Russian? Like, oh, you're native? I would never have guessed that, right? And then I think that this question starts to, you know, this title unpacks why, right? What do we think of when we think of an Indian? And are we talking about these people as either damaged or somewhere way back in time?
Yeah. Absolutely. And we'll keep coming back to this, the title as well. Some of your amazing questions that were sent in this week really were able to help us engage in this, like, modern Indian. What is this concept? And some of the question itself really hearkened to this idea that Indians are, or Indigenous people are, sort of a past type of person, you know. So we'll keep going on that title, and thanks for that, Nykkie. So
I found, just to jump in, I found the question
yeah.
also really spoke to the idea of expectation, both from within the communities and from the kind of settler imposition of what that belief of a modern Indian should be too.
Mm-hmm.
So as I was reading it too, it just continued to raise questions in terms of, there seems to be so many different points of view when it comes to what a modern Indian is, and so many different perspectives in terms of, you know, what the idea of modern is. So that was, I mean, for me, it was a really kind of important title to the lesson, because it constantly kept you trying to figure out, you know, your path through all of this in terms of what that title even means and what does it mean to different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Dan and Paul, you want to show off your t-shirts there for a bit?
Oh, I should do it better.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Good job. Excellent modeling, guys.
Thank you. And I was going to show this part too. Dan, show you
yeah.
the side tattoo.
Very nice.
It's from First People's House. Yeah.
It wasn't just coincidence that we're all wearing orange today. So why gotta be orange? So why we're wearing these orange shirts is September 30th, we encourage everyone to wear an orange shirt. Doesn't have to be specifically these ones, to honor and remember the experiences and loss of thousands of children who were stolen from their families and placed in Indian residential schools. So this is a huge cultural genocide, as we've talked about. So they wanted to sort of turn it around and this painful history into a positive one, and to reclaim this time of year, and really talk about, like, our students coming back to post-secondary. And just because our students leave their home fires to come to continue their academic journeys doesn't mean they have to leave behind their traditions. So we have an amazing quote from Shayna Dion, who's at the University of Alberta, and she's the Assistant Dean of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. And I want to say this because she's so poetic and articulate. So these are Shayna's words. Autumn can be the saddest time for so many survivors, because the changing of the leaves mean that we're not going to see their families for a very long time, a full school year, or sadly never see their families again. Most of us now can hardly leave our little ones in daycare or school for a day, never mind a whole year of wondering, how are they doing? Are they happy? Are they having a good day? Has anyone hurt them? Are they sick? Are they in pain? For the most part, there is little or no communication between children sent to Indian residential school and their families. Can you imagine? Imagine being taken away from your parents at the age of 5, being given a number instead of a name, being punished for speaking the only language you know, being cut off from your family. Imagine being a parent, being threatened with jail if you didn't give up your children. Imagine being cut off from your children for 10 years. What would that do to your family? On a personal note, Shayna says, as a first-generation survivor, if given the opportunity, I always want to honor Nothawi, my father, George Dion, who was stolen from his mother, and my Kukum grandmother, Sarah Dion, to attend Blue Quills Residential School for 5 years when he was very young. I wear my orange shirt to honor intergenerational survivors. I honor their pain and their peace. I honor their love and their sorrow. I honor their brokenness and resilience. I honor their grit and grace. I honor their shame and their pride. I honor their loneliness and lovability. I honor their sadness and humor. We are the sum of many parts, all to be honored equally. Powerful words.
Holy, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So,
Thanks, eh?
Yeah. Thank you, Shayna.
She's my neighbor.
Yeah, she is. So we've got a lot of questions to go through. So you guys ready for this?
Art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Jeannie's wondering if the inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls acknowledge the possible role of enfranchisement on the numbers of Indigenous and Métis women and girls in terms of historical impact of the loss of support and termination of band membership, preventing them from accessing their home communities. She says, we state women were separated from their communities on a number of levels, including emotionally, physically, geographically, and spiritually, end quote. So it made Jeannie wonder if the inquiry looked at the role of this intergenerational wounding and why so many have gone missing and been murdered. We think of the importance of women in the family. The despair from the loss of the connection is quite sobering. So just to start off, there is a Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission final report. It's free online, and you're able to access that quite easily. Paul, you wanted to address this question a little bit, hey?
Yeah, just a bit too, like in terms of like a universal experience and how we frame, sometimes how we see Indigenous people. So the language we use is so important, and it's kind of confusing when we think about, you know, what Nykkie talked about in terms of legal structures. Like we talk about Indian, we talk about, and then we say Aboriginal, which is First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, FNMI. And I feel sometimes we still absorb these as racialized categories. And we still see, for example, I often see, and this will happen all over, Indigenous and Métis, you know? So it really gets away from how Indigenous people frame identity around collectivity and, you know, nationhood, right? And peoplehood. So it's really important to reframe the work that we do is in Indigenous studies, right? But within that, there are all these multiple nations that each have their own gifts and experiences and orientation and meaning in wanting to relate to each other and hang out together and party, right? So, so very important. So like when it comes to like there's a racialized way that we see things, and when it comes to missing Indigenous women and girls, there's a racialized aspect of that too that links to structural racism and structural like sexism, right? So like this is a really important thing to reflect on how society sees Indigenous people, and then how Indigenous people see indigeneity, right? So.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
adding to that, I mean, it's semantics, but when we say Indigenous and Métis, it's also important to keep in mind that Métis are Indigenous. And in a lot of scholarship and activism, a lot of times for our viewers out there, you might see the term Indigenous peoples, that it's pluralized. And the reason that they say peoples is to remember that when we say Indigenous, although that's a global pan Indigenous term, which is really great, it's also important not to essentialize and to understand and realize that there is great diversity among those people, and that's why they say peoples. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we're having these, you know, these important conversations about the specificity of words, which again has been a big kind of, I've always kind of mentioned the importance of the specificity of words because I do think it changes conversation, and and a lot of people speak without not really knowing, you know, the true implications or the definition of what they're saying. So we're learning to eradicate civilized, you know, peoples, communities was a big one that I learned in the beginning of these discussions. BiPOC is a term that we hear more and more these days, which broken down means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I had a question from the Indigenous perspective. What does BiPOC, what does it mean to you? Because I do know that there's different perspectives on it. You know, I think, you know, in certain cases it can be seen as kind of minimizing a group of people into another collective that feels kind of potentially digestible for a settler, you know, construct. But on the other hand, you know, as a member of like the LGBTQIA plus community, it is a way of acknowledging. So I just wanted to, I thought it was kind of an important question to pose for people at home who might be seeing BiPOC and wondering whether they should be using it, how they should be using it, what it means to you.
That's a great question, and I love talking about this type of thing. What's this, Paul? Doesn't mean you have to.
Guns firing here. Boom, 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 boom.
I don't know the sign language. So just like when the term Indigenous came out, we talked about that, I think, in Module 1, Worldviews. Having the word Indigenous can be incredibly empowering because as Nykkie said, it's a global word that, you know, has really infiltrated academia and, you know, trickled out everywhere. So this talks about the Hawaiians, the Maori people of Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, Sami, so many different Indigenous people across the world because of our similar colonial experience. I say similar, but not the same. Aboriginal people of Australia as well. So there's similarities. And so there is power in that kind of solidarity. You know, we have large Indigenous conferences where we all come together and you can hear from all different kinds of people and their experiences, the resilience and hope and the programs they're doing. And it's so empowering that way. So to include BiPOC, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color expands that circle of strength for me. And that's how I see it. You know, we may not have the same colonial experience, but we certainly experience systemic racism and white supremacy in the same way. You know, we have our children are hurt, our people are suffering, there's oppression. And so there is that power in numbers and how I feel. So I welcome the term, but I also, there's caveats to everything, and you can't just lump people's experiences in just when you see a nice, palatable, handy little BiPOC, like, or Indigenous. Don't lump everyone's experiences in together, but understand that there are similarities instead.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that it signifies allyship, which is really exciting and definitely needed if we look at what's going on in the news in Canada and the US right now. More than ever, allyship is needed, not only among these communities, but also for settlers outside of those BiPOC communities. However, again, like Tracy said, there are caveats. I think it's really important to also think about, you know, when we're using these terms BiPOC, when we're allying either as those in or outside that community, it's important to always be checking ourselves and ask, who are we speaking for? Because there's a big difference between speaking with and, you know, compared to speaking above and for. So keeping that in check, I think it's a great opportunity, you know, with a global struggle.
Fantastic. Yeah. Speaking for, that happens so much. It's like, I'm speaking for you, I'm going to help you out, right? So yeah, it's something that I've been noticing a lot with, because BiPOC has become a very like strong political term over this year specifically, right, with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I always find so interesting that Indigenous people get erased at all levels, you know. I always see these memes that were flowing in the US, especially all this US and Canadian exceptionalism about being a settler from here. It erases the fact that land has been stolen and relations have been fragmented. That there'll always be like, oh, Black Lives Matter in this house, you know, gender diversity matters, sexual diversity matters, and then Indigenous. But where's Indigenous people in those houses, right? So I always say, oh, what about Indigenous sovereignty? And they're like, oh, you know, like, oh, great, I forgot. And yeah, and it even comes up like, I was talking about this yesterday with you guys, is that I was just in a meeting, and what's floating around right now is EDID, equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And continually. So this is a major part of how institutions are framing their moving forward away from equality, away from like freedom or liberté or whatever, you know, the French Revolution. So they're moving towards EDID, and constantly everyone kept dropping the last D. They kept saying EDI over again. And I think it's something implicit to settler society that we don't know how to move forward with decolonization, right? And this is really important to reflect on, you know, and make it uncomfortable that the D is important, right? Don't drop the D unless you're a metalhead or something. So, you know, just like like the way that Tracy says, it's just like this is a global struggle. We're all diverse within our experiences, Black experience, people of color experience, as well as Indigenous experience, and that has to do with decolonization.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, you know, when we talk about post-colonial countries and when we talk about decolonization, a lot of times, like the Indian, going back to our title, the modern Indian, we talk about colonialism as this event that happened a long time ago. It's in the past, so you get this discourse of, well, get over it. It's gone, right? But it's not, right? Colonialism and the impacts are still being felt here and other places in the world, and I think that's what gets lost. So, you know, when we label a country as post-colonial, it almost, you know, lets you off the hook of, okay, well, we've done that work, right? In the 60s and the 70s, there was a global movement toward decolonization. So we're already there, and we're always looking at progress as this, okay, well, we've checked this box. Now we're moving on, without really understanding that these issues aren't just in the past. They're ongoing. They're happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Very good point.
I mean, I think too, just in terms of what we're learning, you know, in terms of, you know, the dismantling of culture, you can't look at some of the systemic problems that are happening in communities and say, well, let's just move forward. It doesn't
get over
solve
it.
the problem. That's the big, you know, one of the major themes and the major takeaways from this, you know, the experience that we're having right now is that you have to contextualize everyone's experience and realize that sometimes you can't just bulldoze forward with the hopes that we can just change things ahead of us without understanding how and why things have happened, so that you can better accommodate a positive change moving forward, so that you can specialize the potential solutions without just putting a blanket kind of, well, let's just either throw money at the problem or let's just throw, you know, I mean, we've seen it even in you know, in the Indian Act, it just feels like these random blanket, horrible decisions that are made that really have no connection, understanding, respect for what came before.
Yep. Or consultation, right? A major part of like UNDRIP and like the way to move forward.
Oh,
right
speaking of UNDRIP, didn't we end with a challenge or a question for people last week? We did. Remember, I asked them a question about UNDRIP. Who do you think were the last 4 countries to sign UNDRIP? Yeah.
And the answer is?
Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, Aotearoa. And how come? Nykkie, how come they didn't sign?
Yeah, Nykkie.
They were very reluctant to sign. Yeah.
Because it talked about sovereignty and it talked about land back, right? And so Canada, I guess these 4 countries feel like they have a lot to lose in this idea. And so, you know, the reluctance came from acknowledging the idea that Canada, Australia, US, and New Zealand had land stolen. And the thought of giving it back or even sharing was just unthinkable. And so those were the last 4 countries to sign.
Absolutely. I mean, for those 4 countries, it would completely dismantle and disrupt the myth of those being very, you know, liberal, industrialized, multicultural nations that are accepting. And although there's this awful colonial past, you know, they've moved forward, right? This would, you know, reveal that's not the case.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so deep, so deep.
Yeah. So for those of you that guessed the right answers, well done. 100%.
Good job. You all get $100 each.
What?
Put a little asterisk on that one.
Right there.
That was a joke.
That was $100 Canadian.
Now we're gonna get questions. Where's my
Just
$100?
joking. Sorry.
Okay, so we have it's a long question, but basically Jillian's asking about the Indian Act, 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act, about Indigenous women marrying non-Indigenous men or non-status men, actually, and then losing all of their status. So essentially becoming a non-Indian. She wanted to know about the incredible advocacy of the many Indigenous women that led to these legal changes in their communities and legislations. And absolutely, we didn't forget about the Indigenous women going forward, but what we did is we put that in Module 9. So don't skip Module 9. It's amazing. It's Indigenous women, girls, and genderful people. And I just wanted to mention also to Jillian and others that we had an amazing matriarch recently pass, Nellie Carlson. And she was a co-founder of Indian Rights for Indian Women, and such a prominent leader, amazing force, and such a gentle spirit. And she was one of those women that pushed for Indigenous women's status rights. So a little call out for Nellie Carlson, who did so much work. And the next question is kind of fun, and it provoked a lot of conversation with us. Karen from Maryland, she said, what's the origin and name of the music played before each video section? So one of my favorite bands, you can work out to them because they've got a great beat. It's called Tribe Called Red, or TCR. And a little quick mention about how we got Tribe Called Red. So we were sitting in the boardroom, and this was pre-production, and Onlia, the production company we were working with, said, we've got this little schematic, you can watch a video and you can see what the MOOC might look like for future. And I'm like, okay. So I'm sitting next to Chris Anderson, who's now the Dean of Faculty of Native Studies, and I'm like, if they play flute music, I'm going to lose my mind. And so we sit back, and sure enough, doo-loo-loo, and the flute music comes on. I'm like, oh man, because that's what we think of, right, Nykkie? When we think of Indigenous people, we have flute music in the back. So, but we wanted contemporary music, and so reached out to Tribe Called Red, and not expecting, anything. They're kind of big here, and yeah, they got back to us and said, absolutely, these are the songs that we'd love for you to choose from. And so we did. And so we have this amazing beat and contemporary music, in and out of the videos. And yeah, I just want to also say that we have a couple of videos. I don't know what module they're in, maybe module 12. We have an amazing contemporary sassy satirical group called the 1491s. And if you look on their YouTube channel, they're freaking hilarious.
Really funny.
So they tease about this idea of an Indian store. And so they're being all contemporary, talking to each other. But anytime anyone comes into the Indian store, the flute music goes on.
They get really serious.
Of customers, they're wearing like big feather things. They have their hair in braids, and so they're naked, living up to the expectation of what Indians should be. So
looking stoically up to the sky.
Yeah, exactly. Shirtless and looking really hot, so sexy. It's so part of like American culture. I always think about Star Trek, and I have this like Star Trek mug here that every time Chakotay came up on freaking Voyager, he'd always be like blowing in the wind, and he'd look gorgeous. And I was always like, there's something interesting about that. There's something implicit and implied in how we see Indigenous people as this like abstracted thing, this thing in our heads, right, instead of for real, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I think the music choice, it's just so, it really encapsulates, I think, everything that the lessons are about, connecting the past with the present. There's an electricity to it. There's a drama to it.
Oh.
There's an urgency to it. It feels, there's an electricity to those kind of moments where you, essentially, the interstitials where the one lesson ends and one begins, and they really do act as this kind of beautiful soundtrack to the moments in between the learning, where, as the students, you are sitting with what you've learned and, grappling and trying to understand and empathizing, and it just helps. It's just an incredible, well, I'm glad that we now have all that information out, because I'm sure there were a lot of people that have been very eager to find out where that music came from and how they could get more of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
in my head right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally.
Can you hear it?
We can put it in the background.
I absolutely can.
I can't edit nothing.
We're not that technologically advanced here in our little group to be able to do
No,
that.
Get there one day.
I just
this
put
is
it on
pretty
my
good.
phone.
Just play it in the back.
Okay, from Lorna, week 6. Oh, she's a little bit ahead of us. She's talking about resource extraction and shifting roles, introducing the topic of Indigenous involvement in World War I and II. Specifically, she says, we state, quote, other reasons for enlisting included having their family members or friends enlist and to honor the relationship between themselves and the British Crown, end quote. Say what? Well, I'm grateful to these men and women for their service. Unlike my great-great-uncle who served in World War I, who was white, I'm having a difficult time understanding why Indigenous people would consider it an honor to serve the British Crown.
Yes.
Paul.
Sorry.
The same British Crown who tried to assimilate them among other atrocities we've already discussed. What do you think, Nykkie? Why would Indigenous people sign up to fight in wars?
For the clown.
For the clown, yeah, for the crown. And yeah, on the surface, it can look really counterintuitive, but it's really important to remember that for Indigenous peoples, this went back to treaty and treaty making. And so it wasn't necessarily, oh, well, the government's done us harm. The government of Canada has wronged us. Therefore, we're not going to support them, right? When the treaties were made, they included the wampum, which is the 2 rows of beads. And if for those of you who want to Google wampum belt, you'll see that the beads are in straight lines. They run parallel. They never cross over. They're the same size. And so while that sounds like a lesson in arts and crafts, it's not. It's very significant in that the spirit of all the treaties signed, right, with the wampum and, the spirit for Indigenous peoples of when those treaties were made and negotiated and signed was the idea that it was sovereign and respected nation-to-nation agreements that were made to support each other and to move along together. Right? Not over and above, not better, not bigger, but together with. And a lot of times when, you might have heard in the news or in the MOOC or other readings, that idea that Indigenous peoples never surrendered their sovereignty, that's where it's coming from. Because the very spirit of the treaties are a nation-to-nation sovereign friendship. And so in that sense, when the treaties were signed with Victoria, there was that same sense of loyalty, not against, the government's wronged us, to heck with them, we're having nothing to do with it, but rather to honor that friendship, that nation-to-nation, that will work together for common goals. So when we think about it that way, we can then understand why Indigenous peoples were quite eager to sign up and participate in the world wars, which, is a history that's not as well known.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
well said.
And it's a good challenge then to think of what Nykkie said and then to see how you can read UNDRIP, the declaration better, right? And to see why Canada might not is capable of really honoring that, the spirit and the law of that, right? Because there's this lack of recognition of nation to nation, going all the way back to not conquest, to arrival.
Yeah.
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 For sure.
And then we wanted to tie this question into a question by Cyrus. So they say, in this week's material, I'm interested in the contemporary impacts of war in residential schools on Native peoples. Based on the timing, it seems that the men leaving to go to war would have been former residential school students. If I'm correct in making this link, were there compound intergenerational traumas as a result of being a war veteran and residential school student? Are there connections between the two experiences, or do they run separately from each other? And I immediately thought of my grandfather, Edgar Bear, who had signed up for World War II. His brother and his two sisters did, actually, and all four had been to residential schools. And even though my grandpa didn't talk about the residential schools much, or at all, really, his signing up was something he was really quite proud of. And on our reserve today, you know, in front of the school, there's a little statue commemorating the Bears being a part of this. So his impetus and many others were to be a part and honor their part of the treaties, of being a part of Canada. So yeah, these horrific experiences happen in residential school, which is absolutely mind-blowing to think that, okay, my grandpa actually thought, okay, that happened, but I'm still part of this country. I am still willing to be a part of this country despite what happened. Let's move forward and let's, you know, let me demonstrate putting my life on the line, literally, and leaving my family to demonstrate to Canada that I am, you know, able and willing to go forward and move forward with this. So it's sort of mind-blowing in a way, the huge gratitude, or I don't know what the word is, the huge heart that he had for Canada, despite what had happened to him. And I think we see this playing out little by little in our society when Indigenous people are engaging and trying to reach out and tell the story and celebrate with Canada, but constantly getting that door shut in our faces, you know. When he came back, you know, Indigenous people weren't allowed in the Legion. So he was barred from celebrating when he came back. The government took chunks of land, again, from reserves, for the Veterans Act, for them to celebrate. So when Indigenous people came back from the war, they were still covered under the Indian Act, not the Veterans Act. And so they still had to adhere to that. If you think about Francis Pigmagabo coming home, he was a First Nation soldier. He was a Anishinaabe, and he was the most highly decorated Indigenous soldier in all of the world wars. And he also was the most effective sniper in World War I. But when he came back, he, like his grandfather and father, he was elected chief of his community. But under the Indian Act, he was limited in what he could do. So all of his letters to government and what he wanted to improve on the reserve had to go through the Indian agent, whom he didn't get along with. So even then, they had pass systems. So he couldn't leave his reserve, even as chief, even as this highly decorated, you know, World War I vet. He couldn't leave his reserve. And so eventually the Indian agent really didn't like Pigmagabo's attitude and declared that he was sort of insane and too crazy to keep the job. So he didn't, you know. So it's interesting to see these Indigenous people really trying to engage with Canada and that way, but being shut down constantly.
Holy, thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, and I mean, when we talk about participation, as Sarah had mentioned in our call yesterday, you know, she also talked about how, you know, Indigenous people very proudly serve in the military nowadays and in different facets of law enforcement. And, you know, that even goes back to the wars, right? Where Indigenous men in quite high numbers were volunteering at a time when settlers were being conscripted. And what's really interesting about that is that it also disrupts that negative stereotype about Indigenous peoples as lazy, not wanting to work, not wanting a handout, right? Because again, while conscription was happening, right, no Indigenous people were conscripted. They volunteered, and in quite significant numbers at that. So it's really important to look at that history if we want to disrupt some of these myths and stereotypes we have.
Is a tremendous generosity of spirit,
right? Yeah.
in the face of just nothing but pushback. And I mean, for me, this it really kind of, my mind went to the experience, in the sense that these people were offering their service, leaving a community, experiencing the war, serving their country, feeling, from what it seemed in the lesson, for the first time to experience a kind of equality across the board as being soldiers. That really stuck out to me, because we've been learning so much about the otherness that has been created by the government, to come and experience a kind of equality and neutrality of being as a soldier with your fellow soldiers. What it must have felt like to then come home, Tracy, as you were saying about your grandfather, and be reminded yet again that you are not equal. That was just kind of, it was a picture that was painted in my mind throughout the lesson, that just really kind of it really broke my heart. The idea of coming home after having done something that's so courageous on behalf of a country that then didn't even pay the same respect in return. And that really stood out as being one of the big kind of powerful moments of just how the country failed.
Yeah, and I think it's just, I reflect on this now, because sometimes we're very critical about the military, critical about systems of power and stuff. But I think about every time that we honor our Indigenous veterans, they're very important because of this interpretation, right? That they fight for the nation and they fight for our separate nations, right? So like, I think about the Métis and back to Batoche, there's always an honoring of Métis veterans there, right? And it's very special that they are warriors for the Métis Nation, and that they are fighting the spirit of ancestors and also resistance and resiliency of Indigenous, this capacity.
And just the courage, the absolute courage it took to do that.
So it's not about erasure. This is about centering Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. When we see them, we see our Indigenous warriors and military members, right?
With the same recognition and respect that all vets, should have.
Yeah,
absolutely, Nykkie. There's a second part to this question, and it's talking about the impact of Native women being encouraged to pursue careers in cosmetology, not cosmology, cosmetology.
That too.
All become, palm readers. My understanding is that hair has significance to Native peoples. Are there larger positive cultural, spiritual, or other impacts of being able to work as a hairdresser? Or because it was a tool of assimilation, it was a means to an end? Now, you had some great things to say about this, Nykkie.
Well, I think it lends back to our title again about who we expect and think that the modern Indian is or is supposed to be. And so while certainly for some cultures, hair has significance and there's cultural significance, it had nothing to do with the vocation of hairdressing whatsoever. Rather, hairdressing wasn't a place for ceremony and for spiritual practices. It was a career, it was an option, and it was also a place where one of the very limited spaces where race didn't matter. So while there's those positive aspects, it's also important to remember that not only back then, but still now, a lot of times services, especially beauty services, we tend to see people, like Indigenous peoples, people of color, Black people, so BiPOC, right, in these roles where, they're somehow not considered equal or as deserving as the rest of society, yet it's okay for them to do someone else's hair or nails.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Paul, what were you talking about? What's a half-breed hustle?
I keep thinking about Brenda McDougall, an amazing professor from the University of Ottawa. I don't know if she came up with this, but it's just like it goes back to the military. This idea that that Indigenous people are not erased. Whatever Indigenous peoples do, it's for their own self-determination. So if they speak English, it's about being Indigenous, speaking English, or being a hairdresser. And I always think about the half-breed hustle and how the Métis fall out of the category of status, right? And we often talk about status and non-status. And a lot of non-status people ended up being in this amorphous place where the Métis are. And the Métis are often seen as the forgotten people, but the Métis never forgot who they are. They never forgot who we are, right? So I think there's always this hustle on the side of and I bring it up with other Métis and they love it. They're like, oh my God, this half-breed hustle where, if society is going to turn around and fire you or, shit on you or whatever, you've got this hustle to get by, right? And it's always in the back of your mind, and you've got this thing. You do leather work, you do hairdressing, you do labor. You've got this skill, and that's always there. And I feel like maybe it's not just a half-breed hustle, right? This is Indigenous hustle, this BiPOC hustle of surviving systemic racism. If you lose your 9-to-5 job at the factory because of racialization, what are you going to do, right? So it's part of something that we live with as in the now. Is this 150 years of systemic racism, but then how do we counter that? We do the hustle, right? So hustle.
What's your hustle, Paul?
This job.
What's your side hustle? Or is this your side hustle?
Oh my God, yeah.
You're really this, philanthropist millionaire. You're just doing this for fun.
That's right. Well, that's the privilege of us today, is that we are very privileged as Indigenous people to have these jobs. But it's there. It's always there. What's my hustle? So my hustle is to make as many relations as possible, and to know that I can count on them. And I think that's part of our relationality, right? That's what the Iron Alliance was about. The Naheopot is just we got our relations so we can support each other and fight for each other, and then but still make relations across. We don't lose ourselves to it, right? So Tracy and Nykkie and Dan, you're my hustle.
All right.
There's thousands of people out there that are thinking the same thing for you. We've got thousands of people out there hustling for you.
Yeah, I give you my Oprah Winfrey money.
Oh, that's where the $100 came in. Oh,
you get money. You get money. Yeah.
I get it. Here's from Linda. I'm joining this course and conversation from Sault Ste. Marie, home to a residential school. She talks about a CBC radio broadcast queue at Tom Power and some amazing Indigenous scholars and artists, Adrian Stimson, A.A. Bronson, and the power of apology. During these conversations, participants put forward that reconciliation is an inaccurate term based on the history of Indigenous people and settlers. What's your view of the use of this language and how it colors the perception? So first off, I guess we hearken back to Tanya Harnett's comment that when we see a TRC, we say Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We had the final report come out. There's a lot of work and a lot of programs and projects that have received funding under the heading of reconciliation. But yet, have we ever, I know I haven't, seen anything under a heading of, here's the truth. We seem to omit the truth part of that. So, Nykkie, you had more to say on that as well, the idea of reconciliation in Canada.
Yeah, the idea of reconciliation and what work saying I'm sorry does, right? So for many, I'm thinking back to, Stephen Harper, then Prime Minister's, 2008 apology to, for residential school survivors. And so, there was deep significance, for this apology, because for many, for decades of silence, and being ignored and not listened to, there was finally recognition of what had happened to those survivors. And so for many, their own personal journeys of healing start with that recognition. So, we don't want to take away that importance for those survivors. But then the flip side is it's great to say sorry, but then what action happens after that, right? Sorry isn't just a check mark that, okay, that work is done, we've apologized, we can move forward. It's rather, what are you going to do about it? And, and we look at, how even the term is thrown around, even by our own then Prime Minister, right? So, Stephen Harper in 2008, makes this historic apology. The world is watching. It's all over international news. Yet in 2009, the very next year in Pittsburgh at the G20 meeting, he was talking, about how every nation around the world envies Canada and wants to be Canada, and is on the record saying, quote, "We have no history of colonialism," end quote, right? So what good is an apology if, in a different international forum the very next year, that history of colonialism, that ongoing history and impact, is being erased? So it's really problematic, and, to know that we can't stop there. So in terms of reconciliation, a lot of, a big buzzword nowadays is allyship, right? And especially within, like discourse on the BiPOC movement, it's about allyship. And we need to remember that, even from the LGBTQ community, back in 2015, we're already saying things like allyship is a verb, it's not a noun, right? And that's not just an academic linguistic argument, right? It's saying that you can't just say I'm an ally. It's not enough to just say sorry or I'm an ally. You got to do something about it. There has to be an action to back that up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Actions speak louder than words most of the time.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And Paul, you can relate this to something that's actually going on right now in Canada, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Paul just can be deceitful, right? It's funny, like right now, there's something going on. There's always something going on. What Wet'suwet'en went on, No DAPL went on, and now it's like Mi'kmaq treaty fisheries are going on, right, in Mi'kma'ki, in what is known as the Maritimes right now. And so there's I'd always plug Media Indigena, my most favorite podcast. This latest episode was where Kim Tallberg, who you'll see Module 9, she talked about, they were talking about the Marshall decision, which is a Supreme Court decision that happened in 1999 that sided with treaty recognition of the Mi'kmaq and the fact that they have a treaty fishery. And so they are asserting their treaty rights right now, and they are being, really hammered by settler and corporate interests in stopping this, right, and blocking it for whatever reason. And you should listen to this really great episode of Media Indigena, because they talk about how little or how few fishing rights, that how many licenses are going for these Mi'kmaq fisheries compared to the corporate interests and the billions of dollars being sucked out of the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. So, and it's really interesting to think about how this is just another example of this pushback against Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and how scared corporations and these settler governments are to consulting and it's allowing, you know what I mean? So even the words that I choose are very indicative. And but I loved that Kim was like, man, she was watching all these CTV news reports, and all the settler fisheries have no idea no clue about the treaty, no clue about their history. And then all the Mi'kmaq that they interview know everything about settler history. They know everything about the treaties from 1700s. They know everything. And it's really indicative of how much, and this is why, Dan, this is a great thing that we're doing, is that settler Canadians don't know anything about Indigenous history and how it relates to the now. And that is really something that we have to challenge, and we have to like be uncomfortable with, to overcome and to learn. Because that is, it happens again and again and again, where Indigenous peoples are blocked, and you're like, for what reason? Why should they be playing flutes and like being like in a gift shop somewhere, you know? So half naked, you know.
It just speaks to an inherent entitlement that I think you know the settler community has experienced for centuries. So I think part of the discussions that we have, and part of the work that needs to be done clearly, is the constant checkpoints that settler people need to make when it comes to what they think is right and wrong and why, and what they think they own and deserve and why. Because a lot of times you scratch the surface and you realize there's so much more going on. I mean, I think that's what's been so profound about these discussions that we're having in this course, is that you are reminded week after week that everything you thought you knew, everything you thought you deserved, everything you thought you were entitled to as a settler just by existing is so much more complicated, and oftentimes the opposite of what you had originally believed to be the case. And so, you know, I think the one of the main goals for this whole conversation, and one of the main goals of the intention of these discussions, was to open on a mass scale the conversation of the truth in our country and where we all stand with each other, because the prioritization of settlers in the narrative of this country, in the history of this country, is quite simply not right. It's quite simply not right. So this continues to be, and hopefully for people who are watching at home, continues to be an uncomfortable learning experience. It certainly has been for me. But there's a great energy in the discomfort of knowing that you are changing something, beliefs, ideologies that were essentially kind of just that you inherited through centuries of privilege. So
as everyone's boyfriend Matt Wildcat says, he says settlers have a lot of remembering to do, and it's true, Matt. Right on. You know,
I think of is it Lucille Ball and Ricky saying, "Lucy, you got some splaining to do." I hear that voice in my head when I think of Matt saying, "Settlers, you got some remembering to do." You know.
You'll love that.
If I knew more about technology, I'd just like have a graphic come in the corner of the screen and like talk and then move away.
I want to get on this technology.
I know. It'll like, but you know, we'll keep going, and eventually this will be a very polished.
I think people like our unrefinedness.
Exactly.
It's real talk.
At least I'm hoping.
Yeah.
So, Tanya, non-Indigenous, privileged to work, live and play, traditional unceded territory of Coast Salish people. And so she talks about how she was in healthcare in community health clinics, including Anishinaabe Health and Toronto. And then she specifically talks about this one experience that she had with her first female patient. Within 2 minutes of meeting, told me that all of her problems were Tanya's fault. And while I know it's not true, blah, 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 I do acknowledge and respect historically that her words are valid and accurate. But this moment apparently has stuck with her for a long time. And she's curious about the thoughts and how we would respond to this, the appropriate way to respond to it. She can't go back in time, but love to know her perspective and what I can do or say moving forward as an ally. So we've had a couple of these things come up before, like what do I do as an ally? And I love how Nykkie has, you know, totally put it out there. It's like ally is an action word. It's a verb. It's not a noun. And it's definitely not an adjective to add onto your CV. So Sarah, and we constantly mention Sarah, and we would like to have her on our show soon. She's sort of the producer in the background that helps all of us and is always involved in our conversations. She has these amazing things to say. So she said, structural racism and colonialism is in the now. And this sparked a conversation between all of us. And I said, you know, in any situation, when you see another person, another human being who is suffering or in pain, the first thing you would do is just listen to what they had to say as a human being, you know, having that empathy and love towards someone else, and then not take it personally at all. Settlers ask, well, what do I do in this? Be a human being. That's what we are first. You don't have any idea that person's history and what they're coming to you with. And they could have had their children taken away by social services. They could have had, you know, a grandfather who was in diabetic shock in a hospital waiting room, but people saw him looking Indigenous and thought he was drunk, because a lot of people going into diabetic shock slur their words and they have a fruity smell on their breath. So you're assuming, you know, that they're drunk because they're Indigenous. And so being a human first and putting all of that sort of racial stuff away, but also educating yourself on the territory that you're in, where you are, look around and check yourself. What am I thinking and how am I responding to this? Why am I getting angry at this person who is clearly hurting, in need of some care? In a healthcare profession, you would think that that was the first thing that you would do. That's the first thing I would do. Thoughts, Nykkie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of learning to be a respectful, good ally is also, you know, being in an uncomfortable space at times, and maybe recognizing and reflecting on even asking problematic questions, right? So, you know, for me, when I hear the story, I think it's really great that Tanya wants to do better. That's great. That's a good first step. But I would also problematize the question and the situation, right? Like in healthcare, right? Whether they're nurses or orderlies, doctors, therapists, one of the cornerstones of their education is to not take things personally. A lot of times patients, you know, may be in pain mentally or physically, and they may lash out, and you're dealt with, you're taught, you're given the tools to deal with and diffuse those situations and not take it personally. So for me, when that woman lashed out, it should never have been a race issue. It should have been, oh, here's a patient that's in distress. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm going to use all the tools that I learned in school, but it wasn't. It was a race issue. So I would invite, you know, Tanya or anyone who's been in a similar situation to take a step back, even if it's uncomfortable, because that's where the real learning happens, right? It's not about knowing what to do all the time or asking the communities who are racialized themselves to give you the answers, but to be really self-reflective and, you know, think, why did I take it personally? Why was it a race issue? And that's an opportunity for personal growth and education to learn, as Tracy said, right? What are the experiences? What are the healthcare experiences of those peoples on that territory you're in? You know, I think back to the very sad case, you know, when we talk about this structural type of racism and, you know, assumptions that we make, it makes me think about that very sad case about Brian Sinclair in Winnipeg, Manitoba. So this is back in 2008. And Mr. Sinclair needed to get his catheter changed, so a relatively simple procedure. And he showed up at an emergency room, the Health Sciences Center in downtown Winnipeg. However, he sat for almost 30 hours in an emergency room without care because he was Indigenous looking. He was in a wheelchair because he was in a bit of medical distress. I suppose he appeared as drunk. And so all of those assumptions came in. People just looked at him, thought, okay, there's just another drunk Indian. You know, he's homeless. He's probably just trying to warm up for a bit. He never got into triage, and this man ended up dying, right? So for a country like Canada with our universal healthcare system, for someone to sit in an emergency room in, you know, in a big city downtown, because they were literally ignored to death, as as the news media and as the family put that out, is an absolute disgrace. And unfortunately, it's not an isolated incident, right? Scholars like Mary Jane McCallum in her book, Structures of Indifference, for instance, talk about this, right? So it's so important to challenge ourselves. And again, even as an ally, don't be afraid of making a mistake, right? Or saying the wrong thing. Use it as a moment to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like the BiPOC experience is always being feared, right? And that's a really unifying experience, that like fear of black people, fear of Indigenous people, fear of people of color, fear of black men, fear of Indigenous men, fear of like, people of color. So it's so, it reminds me though, I didn't follow Canada Reads too much, but it comes up with this the experience of Julie Black, and I'm reading it right now. When she spoke about, her book was Cherry Demelin's The Marrow Thieves, and there's a really interesting. We'll put the link out. An altercation that happened in this Canada Reads moment where Julie Black was just defending the book in sort of a back and forth thing, and the white respondent was feeling personally attacked, right? And so this is about white fragility. She felt that this attack from a person that is feared is a personal attack on being white, right? And she says, take it to the altar. And I thought that's such an interesting and important thing to recognize, is that this isn't about you, this is about this is about race and about the fear of race and this internalized and structural thing that's behind it, right? So yeah, white fragility is a really important thing to unpack in everyone, right? In understanding what's behind those things. Why did Brian Sinclair, why was he ignored? Was it because people feared him, or that they didn't feel like they could approach him? It's like, it's something, and in the prairies especially, that's our experience, so. Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting, our questions that come up, and we do get questions about allyship and struggles of allies. So this attacking, and thinking about Julie Black and how the white respondent felt so attacked, when really she was being all chill and calm, and she's using evidence-based material. She was very articulate, but yet that white respondent felt that being attacked. So, so I want to pose that question as we round off our conversation about why then do settlers or white people, why do they feel personally attacked in these cases?
I'd love to start off with an answer. I think it's because your bubble is burst. Everything you thought you knew is, you're being told is wrong, right? And that's part of the structure in the structural racism component, in that, Canada tells this very neat and tidy story of the founding fathers, the British and the French, and this story of progress, right? And multiculturalism. And that's even reflected in education. Oftentimes, if Indigenous peoples are even mentioned up in high school, right? It's either from a damage-centered frame, there's one chapter, if that much, on residential schools, or not at all, right? And so, there's this colonial myth, if you will, of this multicultural happy nation, and it's told and retold. And when someone confronts you and tells you differently, it's this counter narrative that almost doesn't make sense, right? And to all of a sudden hear really provocative, ugly words like Canada is a racist country is really uncomfortable. And for a lot of people, they're hearing that for the first time. And it's not about, pointing fingers at guilt and, trying to personally attack someone, but rather to say that if we're going to talk about Canada, we need to have an honest and frank conversation. We have communities who are suffering, and that's not acceptable. And if we keep talking about, colonialism or, race-based legislation as something that happened way in the past, then we're not going to fix the future.
Yeah, this is so fantastic, Nykkie. Thank you. Like, it's like this. We live in this War of 1812, post-allyship reality, right? With the state and the crown and the state. And it's like the nation state, the US as well, it's all about erasing, right? It's all about erasing Indigenous peoples because of this idea of land back, right? There's so much cognitive dissonance when it comes to that. And I talked about it last week. I mentioned something about, I don't want your pool or whatever. So like, it's so interesting. I think that has to do with like, why would I engage with you when you don't exist in my mind and in the body politic, right? In the mind of what it means to be Canadian. We've already appropriated you. You were there at the Vancouver Olympics, everywhere, right? And it's just, those aren't representations. Those aren't living representations, plural representations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that like Indigenous people are complex people who live with colonization and push back against it, and you know what I mean, and are struggling. It's just, and are agents, right? There's self-determination that has to be affirmed there. So yeah, there's so much there. I just can't put my finger on it. But there's this idea of that, why would I talk to you if you don't exist?
Well, I think there's also something that's so corrosive about ego and about pride. And I think ego and pride play such a crucial, fundamental role in white fragility. Because we're essentially saying, well, I don't have anything, that's not me. But I think for all of us who are learning through these discussions and through this course, and we discussed this yesterday, with knowledge comes an understanding of your place. And I think, it's very hard to be pinned against a wall, and it's very hard to be blamed for something that you technically, physically did not do. But with education, I think comes a tremendous amount of empathy for how and why things happen. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a two-sided conversation. Sometimes it doesn't have to be someone saying something to you that kind of upsets you and you have to say something back. Sometimes the power can come in a one-sided conversation, and have someone talk to you and just listen. That to me is a huge takeaway from this experience, is the idea that all I can do is listen and learn. And I think there's been a huge kind of conversation about the idea of racism, and a lot of people in this pertains to that same concept. A lot of people say, well, I'm not racist. And I think the conversation now is, well, that should be the bare minimum. It's not a matter of you saying you're not racist. It's a matter of you saying, I am anti-racist. Because to be anti-racist involves action.
Yes.
And the fragility of everything. And I think, with that question with Tanya, it's like, I think the hope through these discussions, through this education, through the continual education of what actually happened in your history, what actually happened to the people that you're talking to, hopefully that would change, if you're looking back now, change your reaction and make you realize all I can do is listen. Because I know I have a clearer sense of what's happening now. So all I can do is listen. And that, I think, that is change, and that is power, and that is giving people freedom. Because I think in terms of discussion of the apology, it sets people free when you realize that something that you have been feeling and thinking, something that has been damaging to you, that no one else is acknowledging, the psychological trauma and the kind of repression that I can only imagine that would put on a person. You set that person free when you acknowledge that happened. It's the beginning steps to some kind of a recovery. So in that same sort of sentiment, all I think we can do as settlers, not to generalize this too much, is, as Tracy said, empathize from day one.
Yeah.
Remove judgment, remove ego, remove pride from the conversation, and simply see people for who they are, and have more empathy in terms of what the conversation looks like, knowing that the conversation could very well be one-sided. Let the person talk.
I think Dan was listening to that elder that told me, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. 2 ears, 1 mouth. Listening is a huge part of it. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Mhm.
Amazing words, Dan. That's absolutely 100%. If you want to get marked on anything,
A plus.
No,
love it. Yeah.
Again, I think we can just to wrap this up, and I think you even see this conversation, you see this idea even in the sense that I am doing this course, and this is the only time that I will talk about this because I think it's incredibly pertinent to the context of replacing ourselves in a narrative. I think a lot of people have been, and you know, I'm very grateful for the kind words. People have been applauding me for this discussion. I don't want applause. It's not why I did this. Instead, this is a necessity. It's not, I am not doing this for any kind of recognition other than beginning to repay a debt that I owe, essentially, to a lack of education. So even in terms of the people who are saying like, you're so great for doing this, I appreciate that. But I think what the bigger conversation is all of us should realize that this is just one small step that I am making towards bettering myself and re-educating and recontextualizing my own life. So it's not a matter of doing good or bad. It's a matter of necessity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. These are your actions. It's not just words, right? These are the actions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nykkie, you're our lovely guest today. Did you have any last words or thoughts as we wrap up?
On a more fun note, I think that Dan is now an honorary Cree. I mean, one of two of our teachings are humility and listening, and it sounds like you've got that down. I'd also like to thank you for having me here. I'm very honored to be in this space and share my knowledge and be part of this important conversation. So
it was such a pleasure to have you on here, Nykkie. It's been great.
You're the best.
Yeah.
Do I get $100?
Yeah, oh yeah, you get $200.
We have another amazing guest next week. So next week is Red Power. Oh, I think that's Black Panther. I don't know what our symbol is.
Two arms
Red
up.
Power. Anyway, we'll figure something out. And we have Dr. Shailene Jobin going to join us. So, yeah, it's going to be great. So any final words there, Dan, before we sign off?
I've spoken too much today, so I leave it in someone else's hands.
Well, this was great. Thanks, everybody, for joining in.
See you next week, everybody.
Marcy.
Thank you. Bye.